great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the Mayoral Prayer Breakfast keynote speaker, Emeritus Archbishop Barry Hickey. The 8th Archbishop of Perth, serving from 1991 until his retirement in 2012. Emeritus Archbishop Hickey was ordained as a priest in Rome in 1958. He obtained a licentiate in theology from the Pontifical Urbana University in 1959 and an undergraduate master's degree in social work from the University of Western Australia in 1973. In 1982, Archbishop Hickey, as he was then, was awarded the Medal of the Order of Australia for service to the community, and in 1984 he was made Bishop of Geraldton, while he was then parish priest at the Sacred Heart Parish in Highgate. In 1998, he was named as Relator Generalis by Pope John Paul II, ahead of the Oceania Synod in Rome. After a holiday in Jerusalem in the mid-2000s, the then Archbishop Hickey authored a book, Living Biblically, that encouraged a return to the use and reading of the Bible, and has in separate writings showed his support and encouragement of the charismatic movement. In addition to being appointed to the Homeless Persons Advisory Committee and the West Australian Ethnic Affairs Advisory Committee by the state government, he is credited with rebuilding and completion of the St Mary's Cathedral, Perth, which reopened in 2009. Can I say, if you haven't visited that cathedral, you should. It is world class. Archbishop Hickey will draw upon his personal and extensive experience of working with groups and others to improve the lives of homeless and at-risk people in our community. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Emeritus Archbishop Barry Hickey to the lectern to deliver this morning's keynote address.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and touched on different aspects of my rather long life, and it is just thinking back a life that has been crowded with many different things, many failures, some successes, but I leave that to the Lord to judge. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very pleased to be able to speak this morning about this topic of the vulnerable, the poor and the homeless, because these concerns have been concerns of mine since I was a child. I want to just noted how strong the Christian churches appear to be in this area of Joondalup. So many representatives are here around the tables this morning, and the Anglican St Mark's School well represented and giving us their wonderful music. It's affirming to me that this should be the case, because in my fairly long career I have seen in public life the Christian vision and Christian bodies pushed to the side and losing what might have been their more important place in society. Not that they ever want to be important, but they had a great influence, and I've seen that influence recede as Christian points of view in public decisions seem to be left to one side. So I'm very pleased to see the Christian faith so strong and so strongly represented here this morning. I said this concern for the poor was part of my life. I went to school in Wooloona and then later in Kalgoorlie. I went to the Christian Brothers in Kalgoorlie, and fine body of men they were. And they taught me the values of Jesus, and they said Jesus loves the poor. They told me that's what you have to do, love the poor. Now, I was about 10, 11, I think, at that time. And I went home that night to my father and mother. My father was mining registrar of Kalgoorlie, had been to a number of towns as mining registrar. And I said, "Dad, are we poor?" And he looked at me a little bit strangely and looked at Mum and said, "No, we haven't got a lot of money, but no, we're not poor." And I was so disappointed because God loves the poor. Does God love us? So disappointed. However, the teachings the Christian Brothers gave me about this consideration for the unfortunate in society has stayed with me, and I hope matured over the years. After doing University of WA social work course, I took over the welfare agencies of the church for 10 years and lived in East Perth in Royal Street until the government bought me out and built a huge building there. But it was a humble little terrace house among others, and the poor were living there. So I had two jobs. I had this administration job with the Catholic welfare agencies, and also at night trying to take an interest in the people who lived around me. And we formed a real community, and families helped one another and people helped one another. And there were some sad cases, but they found being part of that community to be a bright part of their life. And some of them, after they'd left, got in touch and said, my life was a misery before I went to Royal Street. I stayed there for a year and it was the happiest of my life. My life's a misery again. I wish I was back. So it is possible to create an atmosphere where people who are vulnerable can thrive for a bit, even if the final solutions are not discovered. When I became Archbishop of Perth, I lived in the city, right behind the big palace there, palace-type building where the priests live, and I lived in a house just at the back of that, and began to notice something about the homeless. There were a lot of homeless people coming in. This is 23 years ago, coming and sleeping on the lawns around the cathedral. And I thought, well, I'm committed to this, I'll find out who they are. So I did get involved with them and asked them who they were, what was going on, and invited one or two to sleep on my side veranda or front veranda when it was raining and cold, and they did so. And I got to know them personally, and I think that was either a blessing or a mistake, because as a blessing, yes, it informed me a lot, and I was able to do what I was preaching, carry it out in showing support for the poor. But it was also a mistake because they are still around and won't let me go and ask me for money, and there we are. So there are pluses and minuses, but overall it was the right thing to do. During that time I've had a chance to lobby for better provisions for the poor, for people with disabilities, for other conditions, and set up agencies such as a manual centre for people with disabilities, Day Dawn, which is set up for Aboriginal homelessness in particular as a lobby without government support, because we don't want any interference in our work, and we probably would have got it because it's very delicate and you have to make enemies to sometimes to make your point. So I was able to do that, but it gave me an insight into why people are homeless, and I'm very, very pleased that the City of Joondalup is looking at different programs for the homeless, because they are here and there's no indication that they will disappear. there are many types of homelessness. Sometimes it's because of the lack of housing, but it's not the main cause. It's often because of mental health issues, that people are not confined as they once were and given a bed. They are allowed to choose for themselves, and many of them are not able to use money too wisely and find themselves unable to pay rents and are out on the street, and their incapacity to deal with some of the complexities of modern life lead to that. Others are young people who've run away from home for probably good reasons and don't know where to go and finally finish up on the streets. The drugs cause a lot of homelessness, an enormous amount of homelessness, and while on the streets they still take drugs and steal in order to continue those drugs and get in trouble with the law, but they finish up homeless. No one wants them. And the group that I contacted was a special group, and I'll tell you a little bit about them. It was an Aboriginal group. A few years ago, the Lockridge camp, which was run by mainly the Brofo family, was closed down by the Premier Gallup. And I think for good reasons, because he was appalled at some of the conditions within that camp of abuse and violence, suicides, suspicious deaths, and child abuse. And I think he had sufficient reason to do something dramatic. But the camp was closed, no provision was made for the housing of the people who lived there. So they drifted around, and many drifted into the centre of the city, and that was the group that I discovered, or they discovered me, and contacts were made. I got to know them personally and their situations, and each one is tragic. And they are still around. 3 of them I'd written into my speech, which I got run off yesterday, that 2 of them spent the night on my verandas in leafy Mount Lawley, but I had to cross out, so it was 3. 3 of the homeless, Aboriginal homeless, children of that group, were on my front and side veranda last night. They are different from other homeless insofar as they have a strong kinship link. So they all have aunties and uncles and cousins, but many of them have been given a Homes West unit and have not been able to manage for various reasons, have been evicted and are back on the streets. It's happening at the moment with a woman who's in Bandiat prison. She was given, after 8 years waiting, she was given a little unit and was doing her best to pay for it through her disability allowance, and then she committed a number of offences, stealing mainly, and is back in prison for 12 months. She's going to lose that house. When she comes out again, she has to start at the back of the list again. So her case is before this advocacy centre day dawn to see what we can do in the meantime to hold the house until she comes out. It may or may not be successful. But these are some of the problems that occur. I don't want to go into great detail, but I think the first shock I received was shortly after I was Archbishop of Perth, when, I can give you her name, a girl named Lorna turned up. She wasn't Aboriginal, but she had mental health problems, and she also had drug problems. She'd been homeless for many years. She was about 24, 25, and I befriended her, spoke to her. She decided to bring all her possessions and camp in my backyard. She brought a bed and a couple of chairs and various household things and blankets and things, and said, "I'm here to stay." But then she informed me that she wouldn't be there long because she had decided to kill herself. So and it worried me deeply. Tried to find her parents, and I did find her parents, and they said she died for us many years ago. We have found it impossible to help her, but they gave me information about her, and I did my best. Then one morning she said, today I'm going to kill myself. That was about 6:30 in the morning when I was going over to the cathedral to celebrate the morning mass. And she said, by the time you finish and come back, I will be dead. And I tried to talk her out of it and said, no, wait a minute, we'll have a good long talk about this. I have to go to the cathedral, but I'll be back. So don't do anything silly until we talk again. And I came back from Mass, and there she was. She'd hanged herself under the carport. She'd found a rope, made a noose, hanged herself, and she was dangling from the supports there. She did exactly what she had planned to do. I felt powerless to stop her. I felt guilty. I know I've told others, don't feel guilty, there are mental health problems, you are not to blame. And I know I wasn't to blame, but I still felt guilty. No one can have that happen to them and feel that there could have been something else they should have done. But she did, she killed herself. I tried mouth-to-mouth resuscitation, even cut her down from the rope, and rang Royal Perth, and they came and with an ambulance, and they brought the police too, but she was dead. She didn't respond to anything. And the police officer said, I wish you hadn't cut her down. And I said I couldn't leave her just as she was. She said, no, it could be a crime scene, it could be murder. And the prime suspect would have been me, of course. But this police officer, God bless him, he was good, but he was so used to that. He'd been to many, many scenes of that nature, and it was just part of his job. It's a hard job to do. But for me it was something that happened. I'd been to suicides before, but this happened on my property, on my watch, and made me think very, very deeply about the care for people with those sort of problems. Can I talk about the biblical perspective? I think my motivation is biblical. From a faith perspective, we look at the Bible and we see how the Jewish communities looked after one another and also the strangers. For instance, Moses said that when you harvest your crops, you don't pick up the gleanings, what's left on the land after the harvest. That belongs to the poor, that belongs to the stranger. Leave it there. And there was also the institution of the Jubilee. The Jubilee was held every 50 years. It was a Sabbath of Sabbaths. It was, the Sabbath comes on the seventh day. The seventh, by 7 weeks, is 7 years, is 49. So on the 50th year, the year after the 49 years of Sabbaths, is a year of Jubilee, when the land that was allocated 50 years ago, which had been alienated or bought and sold or taken or destroyed, was all pulled back together and redistributed so that the people had nothing, were able to regain some land. That was a social welfare provision, really, to make sure that people were not trapped in poverty but had a chance. Debts were forgiven at that time and life went on. The Psalms also speak of the poor, but they do so in a slightly different sense. Israel was poor in the sight of God, but not materially poor. The poverty there was represented a deep dependence on the goodness of God. It meant that they must trust in God. They were poor, they were not able to live without God's providence, and so they had to trust. That's why the manna was given in the desert for just one day. When the people had nothing to eat, God sent manna for them to eat, which covered the earth as like a little hoarfrost or something like that. They could gather it and it'd feed them for the day, but only one day. They needed to trust that the following day, under the providence of God, they would still be fed. So poor in the sight of God is a sense of deep trust in God, dependence on his providence. Jesus also spoke about the poor in spirit, reflecting this idea of the Psalms, that we must trust God. However, material poverty is a duty of society, of families, of individuals, of states, of nations, to make sure that people are not trapped in poverty, because we are all brothers and sisters in God. And that understanding came strongly in the early church. The early church didn't have churches. Churches came a bit later. So they would meet they met first in the synagogues, but they met after they'd been expelled from the synagogues, really. They met in a large house. One of the community who might have a large house, they would meet there. They would pray, they would sing the Psalms, they would reenact the Last Supper, they would affirm one another and then deal with the community business. And they had orphans, they had widows, no social security. They were the responsibility of that community. And the understanding of poverty then was not, we will serve the poor, we will serve the poor. It wasn't that. The poor are with us, and as our brothers and our sisters, they are one with us. And if we stay together, there will be no poverty. People will be supported. I think we need to recapture that early church understanding that the answer to poverty is not simply in terms of services provided, although they are necessary. Services provided leave us comfortable, and the services are out there and we pay for them through our taxes. It's one model, but it's not the biblical model. The biblical model is about inclusion, including people into the community, into the local church, into the community, the general community. And if we design our social services with that in mind, then we will find that we relate to the poor not as alienated or untouchable or out there somewhere, but as our brother or our sister, and look after them. So inclusion, I think, should be a determinate element in any social provision, and it's not necessarily so at the moment. What I found is in dealing with so many of the homeless on a personal level, is that despite their chaotic lives and their antisocial behaviours, I found that they were beautiful people and they became my friends. It became my after-hours job. I had this big administrative job as Archbishop. After hours, I was able to bring them coffee and tea, sandwiches, take them to Royal Perth Hospital Food Bar and shout them a little meal, and do my very best to do something about their problems. Although I didn't have time to do what an agency might do, I took a personal interest in their future. All this put me in touch with a marvellous range of services for the poor around the city of Perth. Food distribution points, free or cheap clothes, a mobile doctor that goes around all the different areas where the poor gather, the refuges for women fleeing abuse, the places where people can take a shower or to have breakfast, and so on. And I have been impressed by the love and the care of all these people for the poorest people in our community. And most of them have Christian motivation. They offer many services, but rarely ever emergency accommodation. For some reason, the government is not keen on emergency accommodation. It prefers the longer-term solution, and it's a good one, where they might fund an agency like the St Vincent de Paul or St Bartholomew's to give long-term accommodation. So they would take in somebody who is homeless, usually a man, and he would enter into sort of a contract to stay there and accept help to acquire the skills to look after his own place when eventually he got one. And I think that's excellent. But emergency accommodation is still needed. I was asked by Premier Barnett to give him a one-page comment on this matter and what my solution would be for an emergency shelter. And I did, and I thought it was rather brilliant. And he said, yes, he would fund it, $4 million. But then the bureaucracy got at it and changed it radically and gave it to somebody else. So I've still got the plans if anyone is interested, but I didn't get 1 cent of the $4 million, and just as well. So emergency shelter is still necessary. It doesn't change the person's homelessness. They're still the same person, and they will be homeless again, most of them, after the emergency shelter. But if it's cold, if it's raining, surely it's to recognise the dignity of even the poorest person. There should be a possibility for that person to have a roof over his or her head for the night. So in planning for the future, I'm sure the City of Joondalup will have a variety of solutions for a variety of people, but accommodation is so necessary, and funds are limited, and therefore private funds might be necessary. By the way, Pope Francis has shown his concern for the homeless in Rome by, some of you will have read, by setting up showers very close to the Vatican and extending the food that was used to be offered from one corner of the Vatican, extending that and making it open to many more people. So much so that I was in Rome 2 weeks ago, and an Italian woman who lives in that area saw that I was a bishop and berated me, Italian woman, berated me for what the Pope was doing. She said he's made my area near the Vatican a slum, and I have to be careful where I walk because the homeless are all around the place and they're messing it all up. You tell him to fix it. But I didn't have the chance to tell the Pope to fix it. But that's one of the consequences. Things are a bit messy once one offers solutions, temporary solutions for the homeless.
Jason got a job.
By the way, when I was asked to speak today on the homeless, I would have preferred, the occasion is not appropriate, to speak about what's going on in the Vatican at the moment. Much more interesting than this. Yes, just recently a Monsignor and a woman who work in the Vatican were arrested because they were leaking sensitive documents to the press. The sensitive documents were the result of an inquiry that the Pope had set up to find out what was going on, because there was talk of corruption and siphoning money here where it shouldn't, and things that shouldn't happen there were happening, and he wanted to know the truth. So that investigation is still going on, but the sensitive documents are being leaked by this Monsignor and this woman to the press. And a couple of books are about to come out detailing all of the stuff that's behind closed doors in the Vatican. So I could have talked about that, but I won't. The Pope, by the way, is on side. I met him twice over the last couple of weeks, but I wanted to congratulate him because what I'm saying today, he's saying too. So I thought that was good. He's enlightened. Just 3 final points before I conclude. Firstly, I think we need to examine the claim that capitalism and the free market and economics reduce poverty. It's often been said that the system we have at the moment, a free market and the capitalist system, reduces poverty. And the claim is based on this, that affluence does trickle down, that our poor in Australia are relatively well off compared to many other countries, because they have mobile phones, television, washing machines, and a guaranteed income from our social security system. That's true, but it's not really the point. Other economists claim, and Pope Francis claims, though he's not an economist, that the same system requires an underclass of unemployed to draw on, or to put back into, for businesses to thrive and for the economy to move ahead. The point is made that the United States, which is the richest country in the world, I believe, but which also has a vast number of people in poverty, often violent, on drugs or despairing with mental health problems. They are there in big numbers. Is that a successful economy or not? The point we have to make is that the economy and the economic system must work not for the few, but for all. Secondly, we have a strange anomaly where funds here in Australia are given to relieve poverty. I find the system strange. About 5 years ago, I attended the launch of a state government program for the homeless worth, from memory, $11 million. And I was intrigued to see how it would be spent. It was spent on a number of programs, and they're probably very well spent and good programs, but the $11 million didn't go to the poor. Not 1 cent went to the poor. The $11 million went to administration, to purchase of buildings, and to salaries. Salaries of people who are not homeless. It is just an anomaly, and I don't know how to solve it, but the $11 million could perhaps have been spent on housing, but it wasn't. It was spent on the salaries of people who looked after the homeless. Is that a good thing? I suppose it is. But it's an anomaly that all that money for the homeless did not go to the homeless in cash. It went to people who are not homeless. Thirdly, a biblical perspective. And it is the perspective I mentioned earlier, that the early communities of the church were multicultural right from the very beginning. They were made up of convert Jews, convert Greeks, convert Romans, and they didn't always get on well together. The Jews, chosen race, they were the top. The Greeks, the Greek empire of culture and beautiful buildings and the arts. The intellectuals, they were the top bracket. The Romans, Roman Empire, look at their might, look at their power. Surely they were the most privileged class. But they were converts, and they had to deal with one another. And the fourth element in those early Christian communities was the slaves. The slaves came in big numbers, attracted by the teaching of Jesus Christ about their value, their dignity, and what Jesus had done for them, and to what he was calling them. And they all had to get on well together as brothers and sisters. So those early Christian communities brought together the people of high rank and the poorest of the poor. That's a great model. They were equal. They all shared the dignity of followers of Jesus, of sons and daughters of God, and shared everything, and there was no poverty. The concept needs to be revived today. If our churches and our communities only serve the poor, it's not sufficient. They must include the poor. Just as we include people with disabilities now, just as we include people of different countries now, so we need to include the poor so that they share and that we share. Embrace them, draw them into local communities and share with them. Think of lone parents, lone families. They need support, they need love, they need other families around them to be drawn in visibly into local government communities, church communities, whatever. They will thrive and feel loved. They will give as well as receive. So our society should draw them into the mainstream through better funding and incentive programs, rely not solely on the trickle-down theories or the handout system. The call of Jesus to love one another is revolutionary, because we then become brothers and sisters, and then we look after one another. God bless, and thank you for listening.